Cindy, thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since being made aware of your work and an admirer of the mission that you're on as well, I'm really grateful to have you here today.
Oh, thank you, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be invited and to support the incredible work that you do as well. So thank you so much.
So, as you are aware, Cindy, we jump straight in with, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Yes, I think there is really, and it's a guiding question that evolves, and I think that is how do we live in harmony with each other and with the natural world that supports us.
And out of interest, when did you get a sense that that question was forming for you?
Well, I think quite young, really. I mean, I've had the good fortune to be born into a family of people who see the world quite differently, of activists, of naturalists, of artists. So the kind of people that always ask questions. And I'm born in London, but I'm mixed heritage. So I've lived for a long time in the global south, in Guyana. So we come through a very different lens. So systems that people see as working and people who are franchised by that system or feel more franchised, that's not the story that we know and that we grew up with. And so you have to try to make sense of what's happened to you and your world and your families, your ancestors, by tuning into a different story. And so that question arose very early for me, though I became more aware that it wasn't just environment or civil rights or human rights. It's as my life has gone on and I've got older, had a much better sense of how interconnected everything is. So when you would set out to solve one problem or to protest against one issue, like apartheid, for example, which I was quite involved in, you start to peel back the layers of the onion and you see these things are deeply interconnected. And in some ways, they do come back to fundamentally how our dominant narratives and belief systems um, condition us, the type of relationship they condition us to have with with each other as a human family and with the natural world.
It's I the idea of being located somewhere else, or to having experiences somewhere else, and almost a space to reflect back on the culture we're raised in, I find is a fascinating experience for anyone. For you, just with that perspective and reflecting on the dominant culture of where in whether it's the UK or the West, how was that to even navigate? I guess.
Well, I think it's quite shocking. It's funny when you start to share your stories when you get older, how different the lenses are that you see the world through. And I think up till fairly recently, people have felt less comfortable about speaking from a place of other because you do get othered. But I had very interesting and brave parents. But the world I grew up in, Mark, isn't the world that you'd probably think of as suitable for most children because extreme violence from the state, the British state, against my immediate family and against my the wider community that I'm part of. And you would see that in Britain, we'd see that in America. Guyana, my father's country, was brutalized and colonized by the British. So you just grow up with some kind of sense of belonging and care at home, but you go out onto the streets and you can see your mother beaten, your father beaten, your brother's beaten, and then on the television you see pictures of people being beaten in the streets, and they're people like you. So it's really quite a lot when I know I have children. I have a child of my own now. I do lots of work with children, and our instinct is to surround them with love and care and to protect them from that kind of really terrifying and traumatic violence. But that's, I'm speaking from my own experience. That's probably the experience of children in 80% of the world today. When you grow up in the franchised Western countries, then that's who gets to write and who gets to tell the stories, who gets to publish the history books. Then that story, then you do have an element of security and safety. There are things of harm that happen, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. But the overall sense is that this is okay, the world is good, it's made, this system kind of works and we do reasonably well by it. But most of the world lives, children growing up grow up in an absolutely terrifying world where their parents or their communities will struggle to provide them with some sense of safety, with basics, food, water. Those aren't, they're not a given. And yet we act as if, when you have COPs and the UN gatherings, that you act as if that's the point of norm, because it's the nations that benefit from that set the agendas. And so, then that's my story, but it's not an unusual one. But it's unusual in the schools that I went to in the UK. But it's certainly not unusual, for probably as I say, probably about 80% of the world's population. So it just makes you see, it feels almost absurd to hear these stories of these great countries that do wonderful things and that this system works, because it simply doesn't when you're at the extractive end of it and the disenfranchised end of it.
It's kind of remarkable, though, the extent to which the story has almost remained somewhat intact. When when you just list off all of that, like it is kind of remarkable that even to this point, you get a sense, even with some of the present turbulence and from that Western perspective, that you see some cracks, but still that story remains either so compelling, or that it was just accepted.
Yeah, well, I think, there's a lot of, having said that, I think, most humans, as I refer to us as a human family, are, really good people. I think in my daily life, I meet, wonderful people. We're surrounded by wonderful people. And if you're, so I think there's a real propagandization of education in the Western world, in Britain and in America. I think if you try, when you start telling other stories, there's a program that I called the Awakenings Workshop, which just gives a kind of snapshot of how climate change and colonization are interconnected. And that can be a really profound experience for people, because they just have never heard stories from those perspectives of First Nations people, of Global South people, and the deep histories of those countries. So I think there's very much that on the side of people who want to know more, but who are confined within that narrative, within that education system. But then there's also the more insidious side, which is that power, that is an incredibly powerful, dominant. It's a very powerful structure that holds that narrative in place, and they pay literally billions of dollars to hold the story in place. Even now, we're seeing the West react very strongly against the threat to Greenland, because it's something that's happening on European territory. But the cracks, if you think who owns the media, that shapes the very much shapes. You refer to cracks, and they're big. That is a big crack, and it's very, very frightening, very alarming, because it's happening, somewhere that it shouldn't happen. If it happens in Palestine, or if it happens in Sudan or Somalia or Venezuela or Central and South America, where it's been happening forever, then it doesn't shake people, because that's kind of oh, it is, it's can't not much we can do about it. That's how it's always been. This is really frightening. But even then, the press are controlled by the people who control politics, the lobbying. So that's very hard to break through that narrative. There's even now the story, instead of a story of absolute, unbridled, I can't even put words to it without saying pejorative things, and I would try to avoid that. But unbridled imperialism, they're still giving airtime to this other narrative. This possibility. There's some debate. They're setting parameters of a debate that really is unspeakable, but because of the press control, that controls what people see, think, and hear. So it's really hard to break through that, which is why podcasts like yours are so brilliant, because you invite in different voices.
I'm really given you're sharing there some of what your experiences were growing up, talking about moments like of acknowledging the great fear that a lot of people experience in growing up. Um, how did you come to? And I know you mentioned just your family, the people that were in it, like different people, like artists and people who are asking questions. How did you come to this sense of like how do we live in harmony with each other? When did that kind of take roots, even as an adult, in forms of how it informed you?
Well, I think it's the one really thing I'm so grateful for is how I was brought up. It was to be really connected with nature and to understand ourselves as part of the natural world. I mean, I have a huge advantage in that I was brought up to some at some time in the South American rainforest, so there's no escaping that. And yeah, but even in London, I got some South London beautiful big commons, and I was born in the era when kids went out to play outside, and you were told to come back, when you were hungry, and it's just so you spent a lot of your days outside. But also with the kind of really interesting community that I grew up in, it was absolutely unthinkable to hate anybody else, no matter how bad the things that happened to you or that done to you or the people you cared about or you saw that what happened around you. We were always taught that hate was an incredibly destructive force and it would destroy you as much as the person that you might be inclined to hate for whatever they've done. So it was really, a privilege to be brought up in that belief system. And my ecosystem comprises everybody of every race, color, nationality, belief. In my adult life, I've been really lucky to live in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, South America, different parts of Europe. So, really for long periods of time, 5 years in each place or more. So, you really get a sense of us as a human family. There's big differences, but there's so many people with a shared purpose, which is harmony, and that all of the great books, whatever you think of religion, have those tenets in them. So somewhere the beliefs there's a knowledge that that's how we need to that these are the codes for thriving. I mean, my personal practice is yoga, which isn't a religion, but it's probably one of the oldest practices of trying to work out how to be a human being in this planet. The Vedic scriptures, some people will say they go back to 30,000 years, but they certainly predate any of the more the big religions that we know, and it's more a philosophical journey of what do we have to do to live well, to put ourselves in a good spiritual place, a place of strength of spirit, and then from that place of strength of spirit, that energy goes out into the world, and it enables us to practice. Yoga is always a practice, balance and harmony, and so yeah. So from the beginning we were taught that hating anything was just absolutely unacceptable. And as you grow up, you can see how that applies and you see all the fractures. I'm not saying I don't have hate and anger, but you're taught to try to work through those and see yourself in as connected to the people that you hate and are making you angry. And then you're taught to even not, you might not need to agree with their story, but you're taught to at least try to understand where they're coming from. So yeah, that's kind of my journey. And as I've got older, I've gone much deeper into the practices of yoga and meditation, and really acknowledging that I think this our spiritual life is the most important part of how of our own development and our ability to be here in that harmonious way. And religion and spirit get very confused, and each of them carry their own loadedness in a way, because people factionalize according to religions and people are terrified of the word spirit. But I think that this is a crisis of spirit. We've lost our codes of really how to what our deep values are, and that starts with an understanding of yourself really and your purpose as a human being.
I could have listened to you carry on for much longer there. That was utterly delightful. But even just what you mentioned there around the sense of there's something so beautiful in not seeing hate as justifiable or the resting stop, like, or the, there's something about realizing that even if I'm experiencing hate in this moment, or anger, whatever it might be, that it won't serve me if I just remain in that place. It's not to say that it won't occur, but I think there's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah, that's right, and I think thank you, Mark. When I say that's right, that is what I was trying to say, and thanks for picking up on it. But I think sometimes anger can serve. It can
Oh,
just that.
absolutely, yeah.
It's like a fire. It's like we have those the five elements: earth, water, ether, fire, space. But sometimes you need that little bit of fire to impel something. And fire can create or destroy. And so it's a matter of understanding how to use it to ignite rather than to burn down. And so sometimes when you feel angry, I don't think you should feel bad about feeling angry, but it's what you decide to do with that anger and how you decide to channel it and manage it that makes the difference of whether it consumes you or whether you can turn it to be a force for good, really, for change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was more suggesting the hate, even though I said the anger, because I absolutely agree with you. The anger, I think, is totally appropriate and helpful in certain circumstances. Really intrigued with this idea that I sometimes get like this a strength of a spiritual practice or a connection with ourselves. It's definitely not to avoid the world or to remove ourselves from the world, but it does feel like some sort of safe harbor within the storm. Curious from your perspective and just navigating navigating your life and the significance of this spiritual practice for you, and just how maybe perhaps that's the significance of just how important that is for you.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, as I said, I grew up in a family of activists. So, to put it in context, the civil rights movement, that my parents are quite involved in that, the apartheid movement, a lot of the things to do with environment, CND, um, to do with as I said, the anti-nuclear movement, and then nearly growing up as myself as a student, again apartheid, a lot of the anti-war movement. It's anti, which is really important, but you're fighting all the time. You're putting your body on the line, quite literally sometimes, on the pavement, being arrested. You're fighting this system pretty hard, and it's really depleting, and it can be very depleting. You have camaraderie, but it can be really depleting, especially seen as when I feel really so, my heart drops. I mean, I've got young people in my life, in my community, and I went down, they were so young on the train. I think they were 16, 15, 16 years old, and that was some of the first youth climate protests, and they went down with all this beautiful, youthful energy and protested their hearts. And I was kind of going down to make sure they were safe, and because I live in Cambridge, we're going down to London. And then on the train back, it was like, okay, we've done that now, so that will get better, And it's such a long struggle. I mean, it's almost an eternal struggle. Whether I look. A lot of my work looks at colonization and climate change, but it's not just the last 500 years. These patterns, I will put it in archetypes, and it really does feel like now of light against darkness, of good against evil. And when you start to look at that in the big patterns of what happens on our earth, there's in the very short time, the 300,000 years that modern humans have been around. We don't know what happened in prehistory. I'm sure there are a lot of incredible civilizations that did live well. We have some knowledge of that through knowledge of First Nations and Indigenous people, but there's also always been these horribly excessive powers that are seeking to dominate and extract from people who are less well defended by them. So, yeah, I think so. You get to a sense that you have to kind of put it into cosmic time, if you like, rather than the things that you can just do in the now, and that you come quickly to a sense that if you aren't taking care of yourself, you're not in a state to go out and make change, but you also become more of aware that you can be the change, as so famously said, that you want to see. And even if you don't actively think, oh, I can be, the only thing that you can really change is yourself. So when you work on yourself, the different energy that you put out around you, to your partner, to your child, to the people that you work with, does change, and it does change things. But it's probably the hardest thing to do. It is, some ways it's easier to walk down the road with a placard telling somebody else they need to do something or change, or going into a boardroom and saying this has to change. But to actually do the work on yourself is really hard. And I think the only way that you can do that is by working on your own spirit. Oh God, I really want to change. It's sitting quite deeply and asking who you are, why you're here, what are your codes that you're going to live by, and how are you going to practice trying to make sure that you stick to those values and those codes. And it is a daily practice. So that's why, sorry, I went long there, but that's why I
This
think it
this no,
comes down
this
to
is the podcast for
spirit.
it,
Yeah.
so it's very much appreciated. The significance, though, of what you're talking about there, and over the course, I've interviewed over 300 people around this question, 150 odd for the podcast, but privately as well. And
Gosh.
I'm really fascinated by this sense of, in my own journey as well, of inner and outer coherence, and just the way you're describing there, that kind of inquiry. And I think people could maybe even perceive, not what you're saying, but in general, it might even perceive something to be like quite rigorous or firm or something. But I don't. I feel the more I'm willing to actually look at um, my own frailty or my own capacity to move away from my center, it becomes a much more compassionate observation. But the significance of that coherence, I think, is I think it's one of the great lost treasures of this life. It doesn't matter if other people see you as integral or not. It's your own inner
Yeah.
experience of that I think is hugely important.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that sometimes that's what makes living here quite hard, because so many of us are aware that we live in this paradox that to get ahead and to get the things that you need to feel secure and be stable, you often have to participate in something that's out of alignment with your own values, at the same time as trying to spin it, as so many corporates do. What are our values? But ultimately, when you look, and I've in the earlier days of CSR and corporate sustainability, when it actually looked like it was going to be quite a radically shifting movement, I was quite involved. But I have to say, while I think that it does have a purpose, it also has been quite co-opted and helps things to stay the same. And in that, people spend a lot of time working out their sustainability messages, but they don't actually spend that much time working out whether they should be in business or not. Because at the stage that we are of the polycrisis, if you like, if you're in a business that isn't actually pushing back Earth's overshoot day, the day when we can see that we've consumed too much, too many resources, or actually is being part of the solving the problem for regeneration, then that's really not a viable way to make money in the long term. And not even the long term now. We're in the short term. It's wholly, some businesses are, do have a purpose and are do have a value, but some are what Buckminster Fuller, I'm sure you know of his work, but he called obnoxico. They just exist to create, value out of nothing that has any value. But we're so trained to to participate in that, and to draw our identities to an extent and our financial rewards from it. And so we live in this paradox that we have to do one thing while so many of us believe another. And it's really, really hard. I refer to corporates because they do it in a very visible way. You know that they're using palm oil or child labor or whatever, or just producing something that nobody needs. And yet they'll spend ages on the branding trying to turn this into a message of integrity and something that is So that happens on very visibly with $1 billion budgets on the corporate or $1 million budgets on the corporate level, but it's also something that we kind of have to do ourselves. You have to go out and do this thing at the same time as trying to tell people, your family, your world that this is a really good thing, and then you've got that thing eating at you that it isn't. And if that thing's eating at you that it isn't, then you kind of need to go in there and think, well, how do I make my peace with that? What would that look like? Who would I be? How would I spend my days? How would I adjust what I do in this world? Which is very, very hard, because sometimes you are left excluded from the things that then badge you as a successful and and worthwhile person. So it's a big decision to make, but it is the one that puts you in alignment or out of alignment with who you are.
Yeah, just nodding along and smiling with the resonance of this. Just in, I previously had a career in finance before stepping into what I'm doing now, and there are
Gosh.
elements of this that I find. I won't go into what I'm contending with at the moment, but there's some elements that I find if you go on your own journey and there is some sense of coherence, I can't lie to myself about what eats me up. And it's this very then interesting experience of then facing the world. And even if it's not a purity thing. Do you get me? Because I do think
Yeah, it's not right.
there is some sort of maturity to this of going, okay, look, the world will not just bend to your will or think whatever you're doing is the right way. But it is a really interesting thing when that expression you said there of what's eating you up, if you create enough space in your day to reflect or to feel how this life moves me or affects me, it can actually be quite limiting in terms of what I am willing, or what other people I've talked to are willing to engage in, or not even negotiate on, but to move on, because it does have that really strong felt experience of, no, that's not presently the way that I can do this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you probably saw the speech that Mark Carney made yesterday in Davos when he said, we've been holding that. He was quoting Václav Havel, saying, what the communists, they all held the sign in the window that said, "Workers of the world unite," but they all knew that there was nothing. It was just pure rhetoric. There was nothing. But what we've all been doing is holding up the sign in the window, and we no longer believe that system serves us. So, which is quite interesting to hear. I mean, Mark Carney's an interesting guy. I mean, he's very pragmatic, and he was in a very difficult position and investing in far too much new fossil fuel development for my liking. But he is a pragmatic and guy, and somebody who does understand climate science. And I thought it was quite powerful to call it out in that way. It's almost the emperor's new clothes, and there's I wonder how that's going to go down, because there is a strength in it that if we all come to, and that's what's so lovely about being in this space of looking at systems differently for systemic change, is that you work with everybody who's gone, ugh, I came on this journey, I peeled back the layers of the onion, I saw how this is such a deeply structural thing, and so I'm walking a different road, and I'm dedicating my time, my life, my energy to building these new models that do offer us a place of safety. So, having said it's quite hard to do, is also quite a liberating thing to do, because you find yourself in a different community of thinkers, and there's so many of us out there, of people out there who are doing incredible work in all parts of the world to build these new models that I think do give humanity a chance to have a pathway to a much more thriving, caring and compassionate world. And I think we need to believe in ourselves, really, because if not, we are just accepting defeat.
There's just something so gorgeously full about all the things you're pointing to, just in terms of the struggles in life, the hardships, the evil, the good that exists, the challenges, and then also the hope that remains, and also the significance of your own connection with with yourself within this. I would love to hear a little bit more about just even the form that uh, some of what that is taking for you in terms of structural changes and thinking. There is just one expression, though, that you mentioned that I have to go back to, in terms of how you navigate this life, and that was the use of the term cosmic time. And just if you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit on the significance of that.
Well, I think we're on Earth time. We're an incredibly young species. We're on a planet that's 4.6 billion years old, and we've been here for, in our modern form, 300,000 years. So if the world was our arm span, we've been here for our right fingertip. So but the arrogance that we have is just staggering. We are a really early stage culture, early stage species, that we believe that we are entitled to so much, that we have answers to this incredible, the mysteries of this universe. We say 4.6 billion years of research and development have gone into. They really have, if you trace the whole evolution of Earth from a ball of gases to a ball of ice to when it actually first began to be a self-regulating system, the Gaia hypothesis. The millions and years that it is taken just to get something out of a pond so it can walk or breathe on land. And yet we come along and think that we have all these answers, and that we can, that we can dominate this. And this is just one little planet. If you look out there, it's part of a, of a subset of subsets of things that it takes you right out in the cosmos, and they are certainly connected. You look how the moon pulls the water. There's a huge influence that these forces have on each other. So, but we deny all of that. We throw that all out, and we say that we're the most important species, and that we're going to make the rules, and that we're going to do things in our own time, and it's going to happen on human time. Even when you're saying, for myself, again, getting older, I think change is going to happen. It's going to happen now. And we're going to stop. We're going to get down even all the targets for COP and the carbon sequestration, or carbon, meeting the carbon reductions. I hope to goodness that they happen. But things are on a much longer time scale. It took me until pretty recently to realise that the change that I want to see, I probably won't see it in my lifetime. It's something that you put your energy, you put it out there, so that you're part of that evolutionary force, which is certainly there, forces of consciousness, forces of change in adaptation. But it's probably not going to happen, while I'm in my lifetime. So that's what I mean about cosmic time. I think humans are incredibly arrogant, and they also have a belief in the permanence of the systems that we're in at the moment. But the system that we're in at the moment, if you very crudely call it, sort of neoliberalism, capitalism on steroids, whatever, that's really only the last 300 years, which even in terms of human systems is a very, very short period. And yet that's the only thing, there's no other way. We can tinker around the edges of it, but we can't actually change this thing. And the thing's changing itself. It's based on a total unsustainable premise. You cannot continue extracting when your resources are finite. It's such an incredible influence that this small species has had on our little pale blue dot. But they've extracted so much and changed the atmospheric composition that it's threatening. Earth is damaged in the way that we know, but the thing that is threatening most is human life. Now, Earth has been a ball of ice before. She will carry on in some form, but it's not going to be a form that is a safe space for human and much other life. So this system doesn't work. But for the little human time, I've been getting away with this for 50 years, a businessman, I've got a big pile to pass on to my family, and so that's been very successful. That's really good. But the child that he's going to pass it on to will have to navigate a whole other set of systems that have been created because they couldn't factor in the earth science into the business models, which are their gods. And so that's what I mean about cosmic time. So we get up and we design our systems for human time, but we're this tiny little, we're a significant, everything life form is significant, but we're part of a much greater force and order and set of influences that we have trained ourselves to ignore.
Does that Does that wider context of time, just out of interest for you, does that give you more, does that slow down the urgency of it, or does it give a wider perspective in ways, or how do you engage with that yourself?
Yeah, it's really, really hard, Mark, because we can't deny there's an urgency. I mean, there's an
Mm.
absolute, physical urgency. We either get this amount of carbon out of the atmosphere, we reduce the heating in the oceans, or we're toast. That's it. And we have a very limited. All the scientists, and I've got massive respect for science. We can see that trajectory. But on the other hand, uh, we're just trapped. There's an element of being trapped. The hardest thing, I think, I don't know if you've seen my children's book, Bright New World, where I explain how everything can be. We're using the brilliant things that are happening already can be solved. These issues, some we've left a bit too late to completely resolve, but they can be mitigated. But the last chapter is called Thinking Differently. And that's the hardest thing. And that's the thing that it feels like isn't going to happen in the time that we have. And because it takes a long time to change those practices. And I was in the conversation with a brilliant First Nations leader who said, "Oh," and I invited him to participate in something that we were doing about, looking at how we can urgently change these systems. And he said, the thing that's terrified me about what you've just said, Cindy, is urgency, because there was such an urgency to extract and make the mess in the first place. And now there's this urgency to go and fix it up. And you can see some of the solutions are just problems in themselves. A lot of the geoengineering, the carbon sequestration, the techno fixes are really quite ill thought out, blocking out the light of the sun. They're just trying to enable a system that's fueling its own demise to carry on a little bit longer. So I think we really have to step out of what are we actually trying to do? Are we trying to shore something that doesn't really work up, or are we trying to take the time and really think about how we might build the new models? And that's the paradox, because nobody wants to think about the loss and the damage and the hurt and the harm that can happen if we don't put the brakes on. But we can't put the brakes on without rethinking, because all we're really doing is rearranging the deck chairs around on the Titanic. Sorry, I'm talking in slight cliches there, but we're trying to turn a tractor, this big extractive machine, into a butterfly, and that's not going to happen. We have to take the time somehow to step out and see ourselves as part of this really complicated cosmic ecosystem, and work out how to design models that are in balance with the universe as opposed to out of balance with the universe. And you know hopefully humans do have the capacity to do that, but it is one hell of a shift.
It's really remarkable when you can be presented with just information, and I wouldn't. I'm not trying to entertain anyone who has no interest in climate change or something like that. But I just mean just in the ways that we consume, and the amount of plastics that are in the ocean, and things that we're doing on a repeated basis, where it's not even some distant causal relationship with what I'm doing. It's like this will end up in probably in an ocean somewhere else, and it will end up in my food system. Or we need oxygen, and there's plankton in the sea that we're destroying, and there's forests that we're cutting down. It is really remarkable, our capacity to not think differently, even when we say we might be heralding the ideas or be doing certain things in the name of logic or bottom lines or returns.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah,
kind of a
absolutely, yeah.
there's a beautiful kind of dissonance in that, if you know what I mean. If the results weren't
Mm,
so horrific.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And yeah, that it's just, if you stepped outside of it, or you've grown up outside of it, or lived outside of it for long enough, it just looks like absolute madness that you would have a value system that places even GDP, the measurement of GDP is one number. You're trying to crunch everything that goes into a living country, a nation, because it is done by nation, which is another construct that I might question, actually. But into one number. So even if you've made this money by weaponry, bombing, destroying, you've made it by polluting, you've made it by making people sick with drugs, cigarettes, alcohol, that still adds up to a positive number. So you're not looking at, so it just looks insane. And there's all the other dimensions of things that you need to bring. If you looked at your family and you said, "Oh, my brother's really poor, my children are sick, my mother's got mental health problems, but I've got a big bank account," would you consider that you were a successful steward of your family? And
Yeah.
yet that's how we measure the health of our nations.
Just when you think of the time, because I do really appreciate this idea of cosmic time, and just, so it's not just meeting fire with fire, almost, in terms of urgent, the example you gave there of meeting urgency with urgency, because I do think it is a different type of thinking. Just from your own journey, are there thoughts or beliefs that you held at one point that changed quite significantly, and just curious about the experience of what maybe contributed to that?
Yeah, well, I, I, I think I do change. What my the main thing that's changed about me, as I said, I feel so grateful that I was brought up with quite a clear north star of what what it of being kind, really, and compassionate, and just seeing yourself quite humble, really, and as part of an ecosystem rather than a dominator. And I don't think that's ever changed. But what has certainly changed about me is this understanding of human time, and what is possible to change in which ways, because and I think some of that's a product of getting older, and some of it's certainly a product of just watching single protests on single issues, which I think are really, really important. But it's become more and more apparent that there has to be a concerted way of looking at those things in interconnection. And that's the piece that I think how we do it. I don't know. We're working on that in the project that I'm working on at Cambridge. We're trying to found a centre for systemic change, which really does bring change makers from around the globe together, who are all working on a different piece of what's causing systemic collapse, or more positively designing the models that can offer us a different way of being here. But it's trying to bring that very much together rather than people working in isolation. And I think that can be sometimes the reason that things are less successful from the more marginalized spaces, because they factionalize quite deeply. You have, oh, this is the most important issue, no, this is the most important issue, oh, you believe that, which we're a subset of people that want change, but you believe this about certain people's rights, or you believe that, and so then they start to split. And I think it really is so important to find a way to coordinate our efforts now and overlook the small divisions in the service of a shared overarching purpose.
When you mentioned at the start, just how do we live in harmony with each other, and also in terms of the planet as well. And then, just even your work at Planetari, where you're talking again about using, well, just from what I've read as well, just the use of this word interconnection, and even just from the idea of the systems thinking, and bringing that into less isolated circumstances or environments. You give me a sense just of the significance of, even if it's with children or whoever else we may be dealing with, the amplifying of this interconnectedness that seems to be so lost on in some parts of the world anyway.
Sorry, Mark, can I just take a step back from that question? Because in answer to the previous one, I will come back to that one. I think that does take immense courage as well. I think that we do have to have the courage to stand up and call out what we see as deeply broken and deeply hurtful and deeply damaging, because I think we're living in an terrifying age of appeasement right now. And that's probably one of the most harmful things ever, there's very few world leaders who have got the courage to stand up and say, we have to look at, we have to call this out for what it is. I'm obviously clearly pointedly referring to Trump, so I hope that is not
No, no.
that's permitted on your podcast. But he's a man who peddles hate, who peddles division, who peddles violence, who executes violence in his own country, and yet almost every world leader is kowtow, is appeasing him. I think we've all become quite fearful of the overarching structures that are destroying us, and it plays out on the macro level with the world leaders, but it plays out on our individual level in terms of what we accept when we know that it's going against the long, the survival of having a better future for our children, to put it quite frankly, or for ourselves. And I think that the courage to call that out is absolutely critical. And I think that's when you ask me about the biggest change, that I think the willingness and the ability to speak that, and the absolute necessity to speak to that, is something that is critical in this work. I think if we carry on pretending that you can fix things that are so badly broken, or change them into something else, it's just not going to happen. Or if we carry on, I don't mean to diminish the work that has happened around CSR or sustainability, or that happens at COP, but there are things that are just so, they're in the service of a system that is not capable of recognizing the depth of the transformation that needs to happen. And it's not about transforming that system, because that is doing exactly the job that it was designed to do, which was to extract to extinction. It's about building the new ones. And so much energy goes into fixing up this thing that was never designed to promote health and well-being on Earth. That energy needs to be shifted into building the new models, however difficult that might seem, or however, I think that's the reality, and acknowledging that gives you a sense of scope of the work that we need to do. So to come to your second part of the question, with the children, I think that's the most critical point to work, because I think children do land eco-literate. They do understand the magic of the natural world. They do understand interconnections, but that's smashed out of them by the current education system. You're encouraged to streamline down, 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 down. You go into classrooms, children are happily playing, working across things. They're learning art through geography, maths, through cooking, and they're doing all these lovely interdisciplinary things in schools where that's possible, not all. But by the time you get to 14, 15, that you're down to 8 something, then you're down to 3, and then you're down to, and even how you're measured as a human being. If you're not good at these subjects, then you're a failure. If you're not good at this, you're going to a second-rate university. It's such a tight classification. So it doesn't even recognize a human being as a complex entity that carries all these incredible gifts and talents inside ourselves. It's reducing you all the time to this one thing that you might be able to go out there and sell to the highest amount that you can get to fit into this spiraling death machine, really. And that is where it comes back to recognizing interconnectivity, even of ourselves. Because if you crush yourself into that tiny little thing that you think that you can go, so much of the rest of you dies. That even the people who make a lot of money are still, people think, oh, drugs and alcohol, it's for people, they're jacked up on all sorts of drugs, they drink heavily, they have to buy stuff to express themselves, because there's just no inner contentment. So I think that it is, when I talk about interconnectivity, it starts with, that recognize it in ourselves and in the systems that we are part of. And unless we do that and redesign fundamentally our education systems to enable young people to be able to see themselves as the potential creators of a regenerative world, as opposed to these reduced cogs, then if we educate like that, then we're in a much better place to build the models that will serve us and enable us to thrive.
I think that's so important for people to recognize or to appreciate just what you've said there. Cindy, on the back of that, I'd love to ask you the question of what is a good life for you?
And I'm so sorry. I'm slightly short of time today. Mark. What is a good life to me? A life where I can be part of bringing compassion, courage, and transformation to myself and to the world around me, starting from my family and moving out to every life that I touch.
I think much of what you've shared today has showed that you're embodying that very much so with the various layers of the onion that you've gone through there with us today. And so, Cindy, thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. I found that immensely inspiring and insightful as well.
It's been such a joy to meet you today.